Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, how did you get started in Buddhism?
For me, it started with meditation. I have problems with my back and was told meditation might help with some physical pain. I tried it out, it helped a little. From there, my curiosity took over, and now here I am down the rabbit hole. How about you?
I suppose I stumbled onto it through a natural curiosity as a child. With a fresh and young beginner's mind, I read texts that interested me, thinking that they held in them secrets and gateways that other paths did not hold. It was not long before I devoted my life to understanding them.
The beginner's mind is such an important and vital stage, and that is what makes it quite dangerous as well. Being exposed to harmful, apocryphal, or dishonest people and materials at this stage can give one the wrong impression of Buddhism and Buddhists. We should strive for the beginner's mind, but still we should be careful.
Indeed. We must explore playfully, but we must not shed our common sense. We must learn joyously, but we must not shed our critical thinking skills. We must study devotedly, but we must not shed our awareness of what we are striving toward. To do so would be destructive.
I hope that our experiences, limited though they may be, can help other beginners know which way is up. That way they can open the door to wondrous teachings beyond their imaginations instead of harmful, hateful, and insular dogma.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing how to get started in Buddhism for true beginners. Now that we have been discussing Buddhism in detail for nearly a year now, we thought we could circle back around and talk about getting started. How does one get started learning about Buddhism? How can you tell if the sources you're looking at are unreliable? How does one become a Buddhist? We hope you enjoy.
If I had this all to do over again, one of the first things I would change is that we would do this episode much earlier than we are.
Yeah, me too.
So anyway, how does one get started learning about Buddhism?
There's no right way to learn about something that somebody is interested in, but there are some general tips that I can give here that I hope will be helpful. All of it also depends on why one is interested in it, like if they are interested for personal religious purposes or for academic purposes or just for casual curiosity. But we will still draw on our own experiences and try to give advice that applies to as many of those purposes as we can possibly speak to, and hopefully more. So let's get started. One thing that's incredibly important for Westerners who wish to wade into Buddhism is to read extensively. Buddhism is a religion of texts. In a previous episode, I mentioned that Ryuichi Abe, my teacher's teacher at Harvard, once wrote that Buddhism is the single largest producer of sacred words in the entire world. And that is really truly the case. Not only is the Buddhist canon one of the largest, if not the largest canons in the world, but there are also tons of commentaries, devotional texts, ritual texts, and popular texts as well. One cannot hope to read all of them, even in a single lifetime. That's not meant to be discouraging, but rather to show that there is a vast and fascinating world out there whenever one walks into Buddhism. However, that being the case, I would say that step one is to read something that's meant to be introductory. Being that I spend most of my time coming to Buddhism from a scholarly perspective, I have loads and loads of problems with nearly every introductory book. They frequently oversimplify things, mistranslate things, misrepresent things, or simply get history or doctrine wrong. But from a personal standpoint, you have to start somewhere. And there are thousands of introductory books on this topic. I'll make sure to put the ones that I think are the best in the show notes. With time, as one studies Buddhism more closely, one will naturally come to understand these issues I bring up, and so there's no need to get hung up on them when you're just about to get started. In addition to reading introductory books, I encourage people to read sutras. When you are studying Christianity, you must read the Bible. When you're studying Hinduism, you must read the Vedas. When you're studying Islam, you must read the Quran. Religions are survived by ritual traditions and holy texts. We can't have access to most of the ritual traditions because they happened in Asia. And so if we're in the West, the way that we get at it is to study the sutras. To study Buddhism without reading the sutras is like trying to study archaeology in Jerusalem from your couch in America. I always direct people to the first sermon, or the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which we read and discussed in a previous episode. This is where the Buddha gives the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, which you'll find is the fundamental doctrine of all of Buddhism. All of Buddhism that comes after it is either commenting on it or existing in the post-Four Noble Truths doctrinal world. Finally, you should also read any story you can about the life of the Buddha. His life story contextualizes the teachings in an incredibly important way, and you can't understand the depth of what Buddhism is getting at without first understanding the life of the man that founded it.
How can you tell if the sources you are looking at are unreliable?
This is a really good question, and it's one that I spend a lot of time going over when I'm teaching my own students at the university. Some of it is common sense, but some may also be unfamiliar to you. Some of it I would never tell my students, but for some of it I would actually tell it to people who are casually or personally interested in Buddhism. So the problem that we're trying to avoid in this question is getting sources that are wrong about Buddhism, of course, but also we're trying to avoid cults. This is a uniquely fascinating and difficult problem when it comes to the study of Buddhism. Obviously, cults are a problem in many different religious and doctrinal worlds, but it's particularly easy to fall into a trap with Buddhist cults. So let's talk a little bit about that. There's a real problem with cults using Buddhist terminology and language in their cult doctrines, while the organization itself has nothing to do with Buddhism at all. So how do we avoid them? One example of something that I would be cautious about telling my students is that when dealing with internet sources, for those that are casually interested in Buddhism, I would really stick to Wikipedia. There is absolutely no danger that Wikipedia will be trying to indoctrinate you into a cult when you look up Buddhism stuff on there. I use Wikipedia sometimes as a graduate student, and I tell my students to use it just to get caught up, just to get brought up to speed on the basic facts about something. What are the different translations of the concept of emptiness? What is Tendai Buddhism? Etc. Wikipedia will give you a robust means of getting the basic terms, the basic names, and then you can go and find other sources about those terms and names that are perhaps more scholarly or more detailed and complete. Additionally, Wikipedia itself cites scholarly sources in many cases, so you can check their bibliography to find more good sources. When it comes to Buddhism stuff, I found that their bibliographies are usually referencing outdated materials, but they're really good materials and have been really transformative in the field nonetheless. Go to any other website at your own risk. You may end up finding a cult website. Some of the red flags that indicate to me a cult website is a .net URL, a blog, or other stuff like that where most of what's going on is personal discourse on what someone individually thinks about Buddhism, or trying to sell you or trying to include you as a member, some sort of membership package or some sort of subscription package, and also other typical red flags of cults. At best, these websites will be wrong about Buddhism, or at worst, they themselves will be a cult website. When dealing with books and articles and stuff, the problem is not so simple as just sticking to Wikipedia. The first thing to do is to research the author. If you look up the author's name and you can't find it, or it is not somebody associated with Buddhism in any way, or it is somebody in charge of or a member of a Buddhist cult, then it's probably not a good book. Another good metric for weighing if a book is good or not is looking at the publishing house. If it is coming from a big university publishing house, like the University of Hawaii Press, or the Yale University Press, or a scholarly outlet like Brill or Macmillan, then there is a good chance it's a good book. University of Hawaii and Yale presses are the heaviest hitters in Buddhist studies. UH is a superstar publishing house, and I think that just about every book that I've read that's come from that publishing house has been fantastic. That said, just because your book does not come from one of those publishing houses does not mean it's a bad book. In fact, those publishing houses rarely publish introductory books. Not all good books are from those publishing houses, but I can confidently say that all books from those publishing houses are good ones.
Just want to re-emphasize, look up the author. If there's a problem, usually when you look up the author, it will come up very quickly.
I should also mention, too, that if anybody is in the process of doing their own research and they have any sort of question about an author or about a website or about something and they want to ask us, is this reliable? Feel free to tweet us or email us or get in touch with us somehow over social media and just ask, and we will offer our opinion on what you found. There's a strong chance that we may not be aware of what it is that you found prior to you sending it to us, but we can certainly lend our own pair of eyes, skeptical and critical of cults and experienced, in some cases, in dealing with indoctrinating books and cult leaders writing books and websites. And we can tell you, okay, this seems fishy or this doesn't seem fishy.
After you've taken some time to actually study cult techniques, it usually becomes pretty easy to detect what they're doing. It's a very particular thing that comes out in the text, usually pretty clearly.
One thing that's unfortunate is that certain cult organizations in Buddhism, even if they are recruiting you in the West or if they are targeting you in the West, they do actually have a connection to something or someone in East Asia. So whenever I was younger and I was an undergrad, I used to think that one way that you could tell legit sources from illegitimate sources was whether or not people behind it came from Japan, China, India, etc. But now I've started to find that even in those places nowadays, there are Buddhist cults whose purpose is, like I said, nothing to do with actually true Buddhism, and is everything to do with trying to alienate you from others, trying to plug you into a financial extortion scheme, trying to use this terminology to try and control your life somehow. And all of this stuff is to be avoided, if possible.
All right, so let's get back to the script. How does one actually become a Buddhist?
This is an interesting question. It's actually up for debate how anybody becomes any religion. Do you just start saying that you're a Buddhist? If you only ever read about Buddhism, are you still a Buddhist? The heart of this question is, what is the barrier of entry? In Christianity, people are often baptized or otherwise brought into the fold of some such church community that they participate in, or in some cases, they actually just have to pray and accept Jesus into their hearts. In the case of Judaism, it's much more strict, and there's actually a long and rigorous sequence of ritual and study that goes on before one can officially call themselves Jewish. And on the other hand, some religions are closed, and only those within a certain group can call themselves a member of it. And on the other hand, others are more like self-declaration religions where you can just say that you're a member and that makes you a member. And my point in bringing all of this up is that it's really difficult to answer the question of how one becomes a member of any religion. And I would argue that understanding the barrier of entry for Buddhism is even more difficult. Some traditions hold that one can become a Buddhist simply by taking spiritual refuge in the three jewels, which are the Buddha, his teaching, which is the Dharma, and the community, which is the Sangha. Other branches, however, are a lot more strict, and they might require you to renounce your home life and go live in a monastery with only a robe and a begging bowl to your name. Some are lighter than that and say that you just have to make an offering to a Buddha. Others think that if you believe anything that the Buddha says, you're a Buddhist. All of that depends on what type of Buddhism you're dealing with and what your own desired level of spiritual engagement with it is. I personally am of the opinion that in this day and age, religion ought to be an individual engagement that happens to become organized if there are people with a shared purpose. And so it should be bottom up rather than top down. And in that case, if you find that you have a particular desired level of engagement with Buddhism, pursue it. No one will become upset with you for doing so. Don't pretend that you can speak for others who have a higher level of spiritual engagement with it, such as monks and nuns who have renounced their home life, renounced their families and attachments and material possessions to go and study the Dharma. But do take joy and fulfillment in spirituality however you want, so long as you're not hurting anybody or speaking for somebody that you're not. And at the same time, if you can find others who want to do the same thing, all the better. It's just that the problems come to arise, as we've talked about before on this podcast, where organized religion starts to become a quote-unquote institution. And it starts to have in-groups and out-groups. And it starts to have factions within it that say this is right and this is wrong. And in those cases, nothing but conflict and tribalism and factionalism can arise. And that's not what the purpose of engaging with Buddhism is. especially for people who are just casually interested or who are personally interested for their own spiritual development. And so in that case, just wade into it to whatever degree you feel comfortable, and hopefully you'll find others who are wading in at that same level, or if not, try and just take joy and fulfillment out of what you engage yourself with. And in those cases, that's perfectly valid in my view. And if it's perfectly valid in your view, then it really doesn't matter what others say. It doesn't really matter if somebody who has renounced their entire family and all their friendships and all their stuff says you're not actually legit. If you feel legit, it's spirituality, it's your own life, you're legit, as long as you're not hurting anybody.
We've said multiple times in this show that there is not one Buddhism, there are multiple Buddhisms, and I suspect that the answer to becoming a Buddhist is going to change based on which one you're interfacing with.
Absolutely. Whenever I speak of those who renounce their home lives and they only have a robe and a begging bowl to their name, I'm speaking, of course, of Theravada. Theravada has a lay community, but Theravada, it argues in particular that the only way to achieve enlightenment is to get everything else out of the way. Everything else being your attachments, your possessions, your relationships. All of that stuff only allows you to perpetuate the illusion of self. On the other hand, if I were to flip to the absolute most liberal, and liberal in the sense of anybody can be included, the liberal school of Buddhism, what comes to mind for me is Pure Land Buddhism in Japan. Whereas Theravada Buddhists have to follow rules like no intoxicants, celibacy, strict rules about speech, strict rules about ownership of stuff, strict rules about violence and stealing and lying and such. Pure Land Buddhists don't have to follow those things nearly as strictly at all. The assumption is that regardless of how hard a person tries in Pure Land Buddhism, they are still a sinner, you might say. But I want you to listen to that word and not hear it in the Christian sense, but hear it in the sense of, as a human being, when we walk, we kill bugs under our feet. And so it's kind of stupid to try and strive for ahimsa, non-violence, lack of killing, if the result is we can't walk. Or, on the other hand, practicing celibacy, though the sentiment is to prevent attachments, we all have seemingly unbreakable attachment to ourselves, to our capital S self. And in Pure Land Buddhism, again, to fight against that just for the sake of starving oneself is not really useful. And so they're allowed to marry, even if they're part of the clergy. The same is true for drinking alcohol and for all kinds of other things. The point of Pure Land Buddhism there is to question the morality teachings and to question how morality is related to one's own awakening. But my point is that there's your whole spectrum. There's a spectrum between Theravada Buddhists, which are very, very serious about the precepts, and the Pure Land Buddhists, and other types of Buddhism in East Asia, which relax the precepts such that you can be a part of it, and you fit into the doctrine of enlightenment, even if you don't give up everything.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode on getting started with Buddhism. Next week, we will be discussing Buddhist cults. What are some notable Buddhist cults? What do they believe? And how can one tell if an organization is a cult or not? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
See you next time. Thank you for listening. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or a review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. Tweet us at brightbuddhism. And join us on our Discord server, The Hidden Sangha, link in description. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you very much.